Rain had soaked the ridge by mid-afternoon, turning the mud underfoot into a slick, sucking mess. I remember the smell of wet wool and gun oil, and the way every step made my boots groan. That's where I want to start. Because if I don't get it down now, I don't know when I'll find the courage. I did something up there, something I've never admitted to anyone, and I'm near the end of my days. Time's running out, and it feels heavier than those packs we carried. I was a private in the 1st Infantry Division, though at the time we didn't think much of numbers or designations. We were just a bunch of kids in damp uniforms, trying to keep each other alive while trying not to think too much about what was waiting down the hill. My comrade, Tommy, he'd been with me since basic, scrappy, stubborn, and the kind of man who could make a joke even when mortar shells shook the dirt around us. We had a rhythm together, watching each other's backs, sharing the little cigarettes and hardtack we scavenged. I trusted him with my life, which made the rest of it even harder to carry. The object, my father's old watch, the one I had pocketed the morning we shipped out, was always with me. The glass was cracked. The hand stopped long before I left the States, but I kept it as a reminder, a silent tether to the life I'd left behind. In the mud that day, I'd finger its edges more than a dozen times, each turn of the winder like pressing against some invisible barbed wire. It was both comfort and curse. The ticking I wished it made seemed to mock my hesitation. We'd been ordered to hold a forward observation point near a small cluster of farmhouses. The artillery was coming down heavy behind us, and the lieutenant, stern, unreadable, was pacing at the edge of the trench. He barked orders, mostly at me, because I had volunteered to relay messages when others were pinned down. The choices I made that day were mine alone, though everyone felt the consequences. There was one moment that changed everything. Tommy and I spotted movement in a barn near the road, shadows flitting between the broken boards. I don't know why I hesitated. Part of me wanted to rush in, to make sure we didn't leave anyone behind. Part of me wanted to stay put, to survive, to keep breathing long enough to get home. And then the order came down from the lieutenant. Hold position. Do not engage unless fired upon. My heart said one thing. The uniform said another. I let the moment slip. I turned back to the trench, signaling to Tommy to follow. We didn't know it yet, but that split-second decision would haunt every year after. Every quiet night when I held the watch and listened to the silence of my own conscience. Tommy never said a word about it, but I knew he noticed. His glance lingered longer than usual, heavy with questions I wasn't ready to answer. The rain blurred the lines of right and wrong that afternoon. The mud pulled at our boots, the wind tore at our faces, and the shadows in that barn, whatever they were, stayed there, untouched. I didn't understand what that choice would cost until weeks later. And there's a detail I've never told anyone, not even my wife, about what followed. Would you have done differently? That question has echoed in my head more times than I can count. I still don't have the answer. The watch ticks only in my mind now, reminding me that some decisions can't be erased, no matter how far from the front you get. By nightfall, the farmhouses were silent except for the rain. Tommy and I huddled in the trench, sharing a half-empty can of coffee, neither of us speaking about the barn. The lieutenant barked again, his voice muffled by the storm. And in that silence, I realized that whatever had been in that barn, it was my choice to leave it untouched. But leaving it behind was only the beginning. The consequences were coming, creeping closer in ways I didn't yet understand. And for the first time, I felt the full weight of what I'd done or hadn't done. I guess that's where part one has to end, because I still haven't found the words to make sense of it myself. We didn't linger long in the barn. Tommy helped the boy to his feet, keeping a steady hand on his shoulder, while I gathered what little belongings the others had. Every movement felt heavy, weighed down not just by mud, but by the knowledge that our presence was only a temporary reprieve. The lieutenant's orders still echoed in my mind. Hold position. Do not engage unless fired upon. That command had defined my choice before, and now it mocked me as we moved through the gray drizzle toward the safety of the ridge. Outside, the fog had lifted just enough to show the shell-pocked fields. The rain had slowed, leaving a mist that clung to everything. I looked back at the barn, at the place I'd left untouched days ago, and for the first time I felt the weight of what survival really meant. We had obeyed orders, but obedience hadn't shielded anyone from danger. Not them, not us. Tommy didn't speak as we trudged through the mud, but I could sense his thoughts, his own silent reckoning. We had always trusted each other in battle, but this was different. This was judgment without word. I kept the watch in my hand, pressing the cracked glass into my palm, hoping its solidity could anchor me as everything else wavered. It was my father's, and in it, I sought something I couldn't name. Forgiveness, perhaps, or a reminder that I was still human. We reached a narrow ditch that offered some cover. The boy stumbled, his thin legs shaking, and I caught him, feeling the full weight of responsibility settle over me. The others followed, moving silently, their faces pale, wary, haunted. I realized that inaction had consequences far beyond the moment. That choice to obey orders and leave the barn untouched had rippled outward, and now we were all caught in it. A sudden noise made me freeze. A branch snapping underfoot, maybe a fox, maybe something worse. Tommy's hand was on my shoulder before I could move, a steadying presence. "Keep moving," he whispered. "We're almost there." I nodded, though my thoughts were elsewhere, tracing the moments I hadn't acted, the faces I hadn't seen, the decisions I'd justified at the time. As we neared the ridge, I saw the lieutenant standing like a statue, rifle in hand, surveying the fields. His eyes found me, and I felt a flicker of panic. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge the civilians with us. He couldn't. Orders were orders, but I realized then that the line between duty and morality wasn't drawn by command. It was drawn by what we chose to do when no one was looking. We made it back to the trench, the boy still trembling, the others clinging to what little hope they had left. Tommy leaned against the mud wall, silent, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. I fingered the watch again, the cracked glass pressing into my palm, and I knew that it would always be a reminder of what I had done and not done. That night, I lay awake in the trench, listening to the rain tapping on the tin roof above us. The barn, the boy, the others, they replayed in my mind like a silent film, each scene punctuated by the faint imaginary tick of the watch. I thought about the choice I had made, about the ease of obedience and the weight of responsibility, and I realized that the hardest part wasn't surviving the war. It was surviving the self I had become because of it. By morning, we would move again, into another skirmish, another decision, another set of consequences. But for now, in the quiet that followed the storm, I understood something I hadn't before. Moral failure is not always immediate, and sometimes it lingers quietly until the world gives you no place to hide. Dawn came pale and gray, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you feel colder than the mud ever could. We were still on that ridge, though the lieutenant had moved forward to check lines we hadn't yet seen. Tommy and I stayed behind, crouched low in the trench, listening to the distant thrum of artillery that never seemed to end. I fingered my father's watch again, the cracked glass pressing into my palm like a silent accusation. The night hadn't offered answers, only questions that clung to us like the wet wool on our shoulders. We could hear voices from the barn now, muted by distance and fog. I didn't want to look, and yet I did. Through the drizzle, I caught a glimpse of a figure stepping between the broken boards, cautious, scanning. The thought hit me. We could have saved them, or at least warned them. Instead, we obeyed orders and froze. My stomach turned, and I could tell Tommy felt it too. He kept glancing at me, eyes narrowed, waiting for some signal I wasn't ready to give. We were supposed to be scouts that day, which meant watching, reporting, and surviving long enough to see another sunrise. But surviving had a different weight when the life you saved, or didn't save, wasn't your own. I remember thinking for the first time that the war wasn't about glory or medals. It was about tiny, impossible decisions, each one a quiet bullet to the conscience. By mid-morning, our position came under light mortar fire. I remember the sharp whistle of shells slicing through the rain and the mud sucking at our boots as we scrambled. Tommy and I huddled together, sharing what little cover we could find. The lieutenant's voice was somewhere in the distance, shouting, cursing, urging us to stay put. Every command felt like a rope pulling me in one direction, while my gut tugged me somewhere else. I kept the watch in my hand the entire time. It had no power now, no ticking to mark seconds, but I treated it like a compass, anchored to something real, something from before the war, when the world was black and white. When a shell hit near our trench, sending mud and water spraying, I squeezed it so hard, I thought I might shatter it. I could feel the fear in Tommy's hand as he gripped my arm. And in that moment, I realized that even if I survived, part of me wouldn't. There was a farmhouse just ahead, half standing, with its roof caved in. I caught sight of movement again, figures darting between shadows, carrying what looked like bundles. I wanted to move, to call out, to do something, but I didn't. I obeyed orders. I stayed put, and when the artillery cleared, the figures were gone. I never knew who they were. Did they survive? Were they even civilians? I didn't ask, and Tommy didn't either. That silence followed us for weeks. Each night, back in the trench or in some abandoned barn, we'd hear echoes. Laughter, cries, whispers from the people we left behind. I started noticing small things. The smell of smoke in the morning, the distant clatter of boots, the way shadows stretched across the mud. Each reminded me of the barn, of that split-second choice that had weighed more than any shell or bullet. Tommy never pressured me to talk. He never asked questions outright. But the way he looked at me, steady, watchful, patient, was more piercing than any officer's glare. I began to realize that some guilt is shared, unspoken, carried not in words, but in how another man's eyes hold you accountable. That's the part that still scares me. By the time the lieutenant returned, the ridge was quiet again, almost too quiet. He gave orders as if nothing had happened, and I obeyed. The fog hung over us like a shroud, and I fingered the watch in my pocket, knowing that whatever came next, the choices I'd already made couldn't be undone. And then the first call came, not from the lieutenant, not from the radio, but from somewhere deeper. The kind of voice you hear only when it's too late. The consequences of leaving the barn untouched were beginning to show themselves. The next morning, the ridge was eerily still. The mist hung low over the fields, curling around the jagged remnants of trees and splintered fences. We moved cautiously, Tommy beside me, the boy clinging to his hand. The others followed in silence, each of us carrying the weight of what we'd left behind, and what we were trying to protect now. The lieutenant had given no orders beyond keep moving, which meant the decisions were ours again. And that thought was heavier than any artillery shell. We came to a shallow stream cutting across the mud, its water brown and rushing fast from the rain. The boy slipped, and I caught him, holding him tight as he trembled. His eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw something that chilled me. Recognition or accusation, I couldn't tell. I wanted to speak, to explain, to say that I had meant well, that I had followed orders. But the words wouldn't come. They never did. Tommy knelt beside me, muttering softly to the boy, trying to steady him, to give him some comfort in a world that had offered so little. I watched, feeling the old gnawing guilt twist in my gut. That barn, those shadows, the choice I had made days ago. It all came rushing back. Every hesitation, every rationalization, every flicker of self-preservation that had kept me from acting. I wondered if it was ever possible to undo what I'd done. The lieutenant's voice cut across the morning fog. Sharp, clip, recon the road ahead, move fast. The words were simple, but the meaning was clear. Act or suffer the consequences. We followed, boots sinking in the mud, hearts tight with tension. I kept my fingers on the watch, tracing the cracked glass as if it could somehow guide me through the uncertainty. Each step felt like dragging the weight of all the lives we'd touched, or failed to touch, through the mire. Then we saw them, figures moving along the ridge, armed, cautious, alert. Not soldiers we recognized, but men who looked capable, dangerous, and desperate. Tommy froze beside me, eyes narrowed. I felt the old hesitation rise, sharp and cold. To act could mean death. To wait could mean more suffering. The choice pressed down on me, heavier than the mud, heavier than the pack on my back, heavier than the years of unspoken guilt. I glanced at the boy, his small hand gripping Tommy's. I wanted to protect him, to do right by him. But right by him meant stepping into unknown danger. And the instinct for survival had been drilled into us since we first set foot on foreign soil. I realized then that moral courage and physical courage didn't always align, and sometimes you paid for that disconnect in ways you couldn't foresee. Tommy leaned close, whispering, "We can't let them catch the boy. We have to move." His voice was steady, but I could feel the tension behind it. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. The watch pressed into my palm, silent, broken, yet somehow grounding me. I made the choice to move, to act, but every step carried the memory of inaction at the barn. By the time we cleared the ridge, I knew that the consequences of past decisions were far from over. And worse, I began to see that no matter how far we ran, how carefully we moved, the weight of what I had left behind would follow us, quiet, persistent, and relentless. The call came just after noon, not over the radio, not shouted down the line, but from the trench next to ours, a runner, breathless, eyes wide. "Lieutenant wants you two on the left flank. Move." No explanation. Nothing about why. Tommy and I exchanged a look that said what words couldn't. Something had changed, though we didn't yet know what. The mud slowed us, and my boots squelched with every step. The sound somehow louder than the distant artillery. I kept my hand on the watch, tracing the cracked glass as if it could guide me through the uncertainty. That watch had been with me through every decision, every hesitation, every regret. It was a weight I carried heavier than my pack. When we reached the left flank, the lieutenant was pacing near the edge of a ruined fence. He didn't meet our eyes. His voice, when he finally spoke, was clipped. "Patrol didn't report back. Search the area. Make it quick." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Tommy and I understood the stakes. Someone was out there, and if we didn't move fast, they wouldn't make it. We crept along the ridge, the rain having slowed to a drizzle, the fog thick enough to hide shapes but not enough to hide movement. Shadows flitted between broken trees. My heart pounded, and I felt that old hesitation creeping back, that gut feeling that maybe I was about to make the wrong choice again. And then I saw it. Tracks in the mud. Small, hurried footprints leading toward the barn from the other day. My stomach sank. The barn. The place I had left untouched. Thinking we were obeying orders. Thinking survival was the safer choice. Tommy noticed the tracks too. He didn't say a word, but his hand brushed mine briefly. A silent anchor. A shared understanding that the past was catching up with us. We followed the footprints to the edge of the farmyard, the barn looming like a shadowed sentinel. Broken boards jutted from the walls, and water pooled in the ruts of the wheel tracks. I could hear something faint, a sound that didn't belong. A low, almost human whimper, carried by the wind and rain. I froze. Tommy froze. My fingers tightened around the watch. I knew that whatever was inside, it was connected to that decision I'd made days ago. I could justify it then, obeying orders, not risking ourselves. But justification didn't matter now. Not if someone had been left to face whatever horror we'd ignored. The whimper grew, desperate and small. And then a thought hit me. A detail I'd overlooked in the mud, in the shadows, in the storm. Something about the footprints, the timing, the direction. It didn't make sense. Not everything was as it seemed. I wanted to move, to rush in. But a cold hesitation gripped me. I knew that once I crossed that threshold, there would be no going back. The decision would be mine, entirely. Tommy whispered, "We've got to see." His voice was steady, but I could hear the doubt underneath, the same doubt that mirrored my own. That's when I realized the barn wasn't just a place. It was the line between action and inaction, between what I had done and what I might still do. I didn't understand yet how it would end, or what the consequences would be, but I knew this. Whatever waited inside, it was tied to my choice. And for the first time, I feared not the shells, not the mud, not the lieutenant's orders, but myself. Night fell quickly, as it always seemed to do in the field, blanketing the ridge in darkness and mist. We set up a small perimeter in the ruins of an old farmhouse, its walls pocked and blackened, and huddled close for warmth. Tommy kept the boy near him, murmuring softly, trying to ease the trembling, while I sat apart, tracing the cracked glass of the watch with my thumb. It was still silent, still broken. Yet every imagined tick pressed in on me like a reminder. Some mistakes can't be fixed. Some choices can't be taken back. The night was alive with distant sounds. Shouts, artillery, the rustle of unseen animals. Each one made me jump, made me feel smaller than I'd ever felt in my life. I tried to focus on breathing, on the steady rhythm of the world beyond our little patch of ruin. But my mind kept returning to the barn, to the boy, to those left behind. Tommy noticed, of course. He didn't ask, but his hand briefly brushed mine, steadying me without words. That touch carried more understanding than any conversation ever could. We hadn't spoken much since that morning, but the tension between action and inaction lingered. I could see it in Tommy's jaw, the way his eyes never stopped scanning the darkness. I could feel it in the boy, clinging to him, sensing perhaps that adults could be dangerous, even when they were trying to help. And I could feel it in myself, the gnawing, relentless weight of decisions I had made, and decisions I had failed to make. Then came the sound, a distant cry, muffled but unmistakable. Not from the boy, not from us. Something farther off, coming from the ridge we had crossed earlier. My stomach tightened. The barn, I knew without knowing how, that it was connected. That choice, my hesitation, my obedience, wasn't done with me yet. And suddenly, the watch in my hand felt heavier than ever, as if it bore witness to everything I'd tried to ignore. Tommy tensed beside me, eyes narrowing. "We need to check it," he whispered. His voice carried urgency, but also that same restraint, the careful balance between instinct and reason. I wanted to argue, to say we should wait until daylight, that we had no idea what we'd face. But the truth was, I couldn't ignore it. That sound demanded a choice. and my past inaction made it impossible to refuse. We crept toward the ridge. The boy held close, the ruins of the farmhouse behind us. The cry grew, more urgent, more human, pulling us forward. My boots sank in mud that seemed to grab at my feet, pulling me back, warning me. I tightened my grip on the watch, imagining its cracked glass pressing a truth into my palm. Some debts aren't settled until faced head-on. As we reached the edge of the ridge, I saw them, figures moving, struggling, caught in the mud, shouting for help, and I realized, with a jolt, that this was the consequence I had feared but not fully understood. The past had caught up to me, demanding action I could no longer delay. And in that moment, I understood something I'd never admitted before. Survival isn't about obeying orders. It's about taking responsibility, no matter the risk. But taking responsibility meant stepping into danger, and I wasn't sure I could do it without failing again. The barn smelled of wet straw and something older, something that had been left to fester in the damp. I stayed at the edge of the doorway, my boots sinking into the mud, fingers clutching the watch as if it could steady my shaking hands. Tommy stood beside me, silent, shoulders tight, eyes fixed on the shadows inside. The whimpering continued, faint and broken, like someone trying to breathe through a nightmare. I had no plan. There was no strategy, only the raw, pressing weight of responsibility. Every instinct screamed to obey orders, to stay safe in the trench. But the whimper tore at something older, something that belonged to decency, to what my mother would have called conscience. I hesitated, and in that hesitation the moment stretched out. That pause, that tiny hesitation, would haunt me far longer than the war itself. Inside, the figures were moving slowly. Not soldiers, not combatants, weapons abandoned or never carried. Just people caught between survival and despair. One of them, a young boy, no older than 16, looked up as we entered, eyes wide, drenched, shivering. He had a thin coat and a hat too big for his head. But what struck me was the look in his eyes. Recognition, or maybe accusation. Like he knew what I had left behind. Tommy stepped forward first. He crouched beside the boy, muttering something under his breath, trying to calm him. I watched, frozen, feeling the full gravity of the choice I'd made days ago. We could have engaged sooner, saved them from whatever hardship they'd endured, but I'd obeyed orders instead. That obedience had been convenient then. But now, staring at the thin, trembling boy, I felt every ounce of that convenience burn in my chest. The barn was crowded with more figures, civilians, a few older men, a woman holding an infant. They had survived somehow, but it was clear they hadn't had a choice in what came next. Their faces were pale, eyes haunted, mouths tight with fear and exhaustion, and I thought, if I had moved differently, if I had acted, they might not have had to live in this shadowed half-world for days on end. The lieutenant's voice carried from outside the barn. Orders, reminders, commands, distant and disconnected from what was happening here. I realized then that orders had no meaning in the face of human need. But orders were what had bound me, restrained me, convinced me that standing still was somehow safer. Somehow right. I could see now how wrong I'd been. Tommy glanced at me, a look that held both understanding and accusation. He didn't say it, but I felt it. This was my responsibility. The watch, once a symbol of connection to a world I'd left behind, now felt like a gauge, counting the time I had left to make amends, or fail entirely. The boy whimpered again, small and fragile, and I finally moved forward. Every step felt like dragging my conscience across the mud, every breath heavy with regret. And then I saw it, a detail I'd missed in the darkness, a sign that survival here had come at a cost I hadn't yet measured. a bundle of clothing tossed aside, and something else, something that made my stomach twist. I realized that the consequences of leaving the barn untouched weren't just about inaction. They were about the choices that followed, the chain reaction I couldn't stop. And for the first time, I understood how fragile our morality could be, how quickly the line between right and wrong blurred when fear and obedience collided. Tommy reached for my arm. "We need to move," he said quietly. But I didn't answer. I couldn't. My eyes were fixed on the detail, and my mind was already tracing the path of every choice I'd made. The barn wasn't just a place anymore. It was a mirror. And what I saw reflected back was not what I wanted to see. The ridge was quiet again, the fog clinging low, as if holding its breath. We approached the struggling figures. Soldiers, civilians. I couldn't tell at first. And I realized with a sinking chest that some of them were the ones we'd left in the barn days ago. Mud caked their clothes, faces streaked with rain and grime, eyes wide with fear and relief all at once. The sound of the boys' small gasp mingled with their murmurs, and I felt the full weight of my past hesitation pressing down, heavier than any artillery. Tommy moved first, slipping through the mud to reach them, offering hands, words, guidance. I followed, slower, each step measured, conscious of the cracks in the watch, pressing into my palm like reminders of every choice I had deferred. The lieutenant's distant shouts, the orders, the discipline, all of it felt meaningless now. It had been my responsibility alone, and I carried it. We worked quickly, helping them up, steadying the trembling, lifting the injured. One man, the oldest of the group, perhaps in his 40s, looked at me as I helped him to a safer spot. His eyes were sharp, and I felt a flicker of judgment there, the kind that doesn't need words. I swallowed hard. There was nothing to explain, only the truth I had avoided. I had waited too long the first time. I had obeyed orders instead of acting. And now, all I could do was try to make right what I could. The boy clung to Tommy, shivering but alive. Relief washed over me in a way I hadn't expected. It was fleeting, though, because I knew the cost of my hesitation. Not everyone would survive. Some had already paid with fear, with exhaustion, with the weight of days alone, and I couldn't undo that. I could only acknowledge it as the watch's imaginary tick pressed on my mind. Some things are permanent. By dawn, we had moved the group back toward our lines, the fog lifting enough to see the battered fields stretching ahead. The lieutenant never came near. Orders had ceased to matter. The moment of choice had passed, leaving only consequences. I looked at Tommy, at the boy, at the men and women who had survived because of a mix of chance and action, delayed too long. I realized that responsibility was heavier than obedience, heavier than courage, heavier than fear. That night, back in the trench, I held the watch once more. I traced the cracks, imagining each one marking a moment of hesitation, a pause that had changed lives. I whispered into the dark, not for anyone to hear, but to unburden the weight I had carried for decades. I had failed first, and acted only when forced by circumstance. I had survived, but only by learning that some decisions cannot be undone, only carried. Would you have done differently? I still ask myself that, and I still don't know. All I know is that time doesn't heal. It only presses the memory closer, like the weight of a hand you cannot remove. I'm older now, my days numbered. The war a long ago shadow. But the barn, the boy, Tommy's steady hand, the watch in my pocket, they live in me as vividly as the mud and rain of that ridge. And I write this now, unsigned, because some confessions are too heavy to share in person, too heavy to bear alone, yet too urgent to stay unspoken. I did what I could. I survived. But the consequences of hesitation are still with me, in every quiet hour, in every remembered choice. The watch is broken, the glass cracked, but it is mine, as is the memory, and it will never leave me.